All right. Good morning. Just so in case you forget, my name is Rick Van Acker. Just call me Rick. We will try to be as informal as we can today. There's going to be a lot of hands-on where you guys are going to be asked to actually get together and do some work. So it's not going to be just kind of sitting back and listening today. We're going to actually try to do some of this. We're going to start off again by kind of reviewing just really briefly some of the current research that shows what's been happening with FBAs. Some of this will be reviewed from the last time I was here, just in terms of where we see some of the most common problem areas as schools get challenged on the development of their FBAs or their behavior intervention plans, so that we can make sure that we're kind of covering those bases as we do this. We're then going to look at a few of the FBAs that you've done to see, okay, based on that, how do you think these would survive a challenge? Do you think these would be okay? Do you think there's areas to be strengthened? And we'll spend a little time thinking about, okay, if let's say it's the behavior intervention plan that seems to be an issue, what could we do to strengthen this? What would you recommend? Then we're going to look at some case studies. So we're going to do it kind of a little bit backwards. Then we're going to say, after we've kind of looked at these and said, okay, this is how it should be, this is how the functional behavioral assessment should look, this is how it should lead into a behavior intervention plan, we're then going to give you a couple of case studies. And we're going to say, okay, look at this data, see if you can determine what the function of the behavior is based on the data that's presented. And based on that, then what would you do for a behavior intervention plan, perhaps, for one of these young men? So that's kind of the plan that we're looking at. I'd like to start off, though, again, you guys have been doing this. You've been out in the schools now, you've been playing this with quite some time. What are some of the concerns you have? What are some things that you thought, boy, I'm going to give a day up, I'm going to come in, I really hope they talk about this, because this has been a real problem for us. Because if there are some issues that you want us to hit, we certainly want to do that. Are there areas of major concern or major issues that you want to talk about? Everybody's happy as a clam? Yes?
Well, just I was telling you a little bit earlier, I think one of the things in our district that we're kind of struggling with is really finding interventions that support, or that are directly related to the function of the behavior. Like I said, we use your blueprint for a lot of times for getting people to kind of have a jumping off point, but from there on, I mean, I have some of the people who are competent doing this but are feeling like they have to get too complicated. You know what I mean? It's and I try to help help them out with it. It's not that complicated. Don't overcomplicate what we can do and what the student can do, and so on and so forth. So I think one of those things is really just trying to figure out what can we do as far as the interventions that are directly related to the function.
Okay, so and that seems to be a real challenge for people on a couple of fronts. One is the fact that I don't think we can underplay the fact that this is a very significant philosophical change to dealing with children's behavior. For the most part, schools have wanted to punish children, and if we punish them effectively enough, they'll stop this crazy behavior, and life will go on. And we're saying that, well, let's think about this. For many of our kids, if punishment would have worked, it would have worked years ago. Obviously, this isn't getting us where we want to be, that we need to look at something different. The other issue is that there's much more pressure on the part of schools. How many of you in the last month have had a parent call your school up in arms because the school has chosen to punish their child for some behavior that, of course, their child either would never do, or maybe they did it, but there was a good reason they did it and you shouldn't be punishing them? Anybody get those kind of calls? Yeah, it's a huge issue in terms of most schools. And one of the things that we're seeing is that parents tend not to want their children punished. It's not like they're keeping their best kids home and just sending us the bad ones. They're sending us the best children they have, and these are their kids, and they don't necessarily just want them punished. If, on the other hand, your intervention has an instructional piece to it, what I'm doing is teaching your child a better way to meet their needs, most parents don't have huge problems with that. So what we're seeing is that this is a much more responsive way to deal with children and to build parental support for the kinds of things that we're doing. Now, it becomes problematic in that oftentimes the kids who have the behavior problems are not the kids schools want to expend energy and resources dealing with. What I'd really like is for Amy here to move to a different school district. All right, is there any way I can get this to be accomplished? And if that's not the case, then it's, I want something that's quick and dirty. I don't necessarily want to have to think about, well, what's her needs and how can I meet these needs? And that sounds awfully positive for a kid who's making me nuts. Let's think about something else. So you really do have a major challenge as you go forth on this. So we'll look at that. And that's one of the reasons today we want to actually say, play with the data, think about this kid, think about what kinds of things might you begin to think about. And what you'll find is that there isn't one way to skin a cat. You can come up with dozens of potential consequences and ways to deal with this, some of them antecedent issues, some of them as a way after the behavior occurs, that you could begin to attack the problem behavior in ways that will help the student become much more socially acceptable and successful. Other areas of concerns? Yes?
When we come in, usually we hear that we've tried it. We throw out together, we've tried it, we've tried it, we've tried it. They have no data to support that they've tried it. They can't remember exactly how long they've tried it. But when we come in, well, we've tried it. So they're already, any suggestions that they put out there, they're already, forget it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a tough one. And I think part of the dilemma is, those of you that are kind of on the cutting edge of different things, if you're looking at some of the stuff coming down the pike for learning disabilities in terms of response to intervention, and that this is not a special ed issue, this is a regular ed issue, that before you would ever refer a child for learning disabilities, you have to document the implementation of 3 scientifically based interventions with enough detail to indicate that A, you made the intervention correctly or in an adequate fashion, and that the child didn't respond to that. Now, everybody's going, oh my God, how are we going to do this? And quite frankly, you probably should be saying, oh my God, how are we going to do this? But this is not new. This actually, if you go even back to 1974 and the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, there was the expectation that schools will have tried interventions prior to referral, and they were supposed to document this, and you were supposed to be asking questions in the team like, what have you tried and can you show me? No, go back, and when you can show me, come back again. We just haven't done it. Traditionally, we've been in special ed, we've kind of been, send us your poor, you're weak, you're tired, and your huddled masses, and we'll fix them. We'll do whatever we can. And the federal government is now kind of saying we need to stop fixing quite so many of them in special ed and do more of it in general ed. So we're probably going to see similar kinds of expectations being pushed over in terms of behavioral kinds of issues, not just learning kinds of issues. So I think that that's going to be, we're going to have to get much tougher at kind of holding the line with regular education people who are referring children and saying, we really do need to have tried something and document the implementation and document the lack of the child's the effectiveness of this plan. There's no magic wand to saying, how do you get a team member to look at their colleagues and say, you haven't done enough yet. Go back and do a little bit more. The other side of it is the fact that many schools, and I mentioned this last time, but I think it's very, very critical. One of the issues of getting a school to start to look at this philosophy and to look at the way we deal with kids more effectively is going to have to start with administrators telling very openly that the idea that you as a teacher can walk into a class of 25 to 27 to 30 kids, have all the knowledge and skills to provide an educational program and a behavior management program that will meet the needs of each and every one of these kids is ludicrous. This is much too complex of a task. You are going to need help. You are going to need support. And the effective teacher is not the teacher who doesn't ask for help. It's the teacher who recognizes it early, asks for help, and comes in. Because what typically happens now is that teachers have this belief that I am supposed to know all this. And if I don't, somehow I am a less effective teacher than my colleagues. So what happens is when I don't know what I'm doing, or when I can't answer the problem for a child, I'll go to my friends. What do you think I should do? You had him last year. What the hell did you do last year? Okay? And we exhaust all of our kind of informal ways. We generally have tried all the stuff we feel comfortable doing. So by the time we refer a kid, there is this kind of underwritten room or kind of belief of that Brenda's a wonderful child. I like Brenda. I want the best for Brenda. But the best has nothing to do with my classroom. Okay? The best is someplace else doing something else. And it's kind of like they've stopped hearing. So in some cases, schools have begun to try to find ways to bring this process in much earlier than it currently is. Again, we talked a little bit last time. Schools have begun to set automatic triggers. The third time Brenda is sent to the office, somebody is going to start a functional assessment on this child to see what's going on in that classroom long before she's going to be sent down enough to where we might need a referral. Because she's already telling us there is something amiss here. Between between the teacher and the way the teacher teaches, the child's characteristics and the curriculum, something's not fitting. Let's see if we can find out what that is. And one of the key aspects of the functional assessment, quite frankly, is not only looking to say what's the function of the behavior, but it's looking to identify what are the contextual variables that serve to occasion the behavior or to support the existence of the behavior after it occurs. So we can sometimes engage in things that this is not a kid change. This is a school staff change. It has very little to do with the kid being able to change anything. And we need to identify those pretty early. So some schools have begun to realize that they have a very significant job of educating teachers to, it's okay to ask for help. In fact, you should be asking for help. If you're a typical classroom, 20% of your kids, 1 in 5, is coming to that classroom with a significant mental health issue. Many of these kids don't qualify for special education. All right? But those behaviors highly impact their success socially and academically in many cases. How do we begin to work with some of those kids? So those are things that I think we have to kind of re-educate our teacher and our administrators as to what the nature of the task is. Other questions or concerns? Yeah.
Have you heard much about the new mandate that we're going to have to be implementing bully plans?
Yes.
And how that ties into what we talked about today? Because I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, it's coming out actually in a couple of places. Yeah, the question was that there's a new mandate that schools are supposed to have a plan in place to deal with bullying in the school. And I'm trying to remember all there's actually 2 places that this is coming from at the present time in terms of legislation. Do you guys, any of you know? Okay. But schools are going to be mandated to have something in place. Now the problem is that most schools have something in place. It is just so poorly implemented and so poorly identified that the likelihood that it's going to be effective is slim to none. All right, now the issue is that laws can't necessarily mandate that you use effective plans and that you do it effectively. All they can mandate is that you have a plan. So it's not going to be that big of a earth-shaking phenomenon for most schools, because in fact many schools have 2 or 3 bullying plans in place, none of them being implemented very well. But the issue comes down that this is a big problem in schools, and again it's one of those that parents are becoming very concerned about in terms of their children being bullied. So schools are being asked to look at that, being able to deal with that. It oftentimes is a school-wide, it's mandated to be as a school-wide issue, so it's going to be a universal. Now you might utilize, if you do like a PBIS or an epidemiological model where you'd have a universal intervention in place dealing with bullying, but then you might have another level that deals with kids who are more at risk and one for kids who are definitely displaying bullying behaviors. Now that's been shown to be one of the most effective models you can have, but you're not mandated to have that kind of a model, at least at this point.
But the kids who are more actively engaging in that behavioral risk would definitely might then have an FBA.
Especially if they're special education. Now we talked last time, this is still in the works. We were talking in terms of some school districts are already starting to look at this. This is not in the future probably going to be just a special education issue. The feds really want the FBA to extend beyond special education to cover all children. So any child in your school who would be displaying behavior that impacts their learning and the learning of others will need to have an FBA and a BIP. My God, we will drown. We can't even do it with the kids we've got mandated to do it with now. I don't know how we would begin to do it there, but that doesn't necessarily stop laws from being made. And quite frankly, there is every reason in the world to believe this should be a universal expectation, not just a special education issue, because there's another group of kids for whom we are suspending and expelling at far greater rates than one would anticipate, and that's basically African Americans, especially African American males. And so the Office of Civil Rights is saying this is not a special ed issue. Now, they were actually looking at this in the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act this last time, but chose not to do it because they already had enough problems trying to get No Child Left Behind and an IDEA to talk nicely to one another. So they decided that, well, let's probably not do this yet. Let's wait. But it may very well come down the next time that's reauthorized. Okay. They were going to throw this out of the special education law and just build it into the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, so it would cover everyone. Other issues? Yes?
I'm looking to get some good interventions for teacher-friendly interventions for the high school setting specifically, because these teachers, they only get the kids for 50 minutes, and they might have 30-plus students, and they need the interventions need to be teacher-friendly and realistic. It's understandable that it's a difficult job for them to make these interventions, but sometimes it's difficult just to get a teacher to initial assignment notebooks on a daily basis.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. My experience has been that middle school and secondary education, high schools, are incredibly difficult places to implement meaningful behavioral intervention plans on an individual basis. And one is because I've got this child for 55 minutes at most. I can hold my breath almost that long, right? Why would I want to change anything that I'm doing for a kid who's only going to be here for one period? The other thing is that we socialize these teachers differently. If you're an elementary education teacher, you're taught to teach a classroom. If you're a special education teacher, you're taught to teach the individual child. If you're a secondary education teacher, you're taught to teach a subject. And then we wonder why these people can't talk well to one another. They really have a very different belief about what my job is. And I think one of the big challenges oftentimes in secondary education programs is to help kids or teachers realize you don't teach chemistry. You teach 23 kids in your chemistry class. And my class has to, what I'm doing to deliver this lesson has to meet the needs of those 23 kids, not just be a damn good chemistry lesson. That's a real hard pill to swallow for some of our teachers. And quite frankly, my experience has been that many of the interventions that secondary education teachers need to be put in are basically, a lot of them are contextual issues. It's the fact that what I'm asking this kid to do has no reality in where this kid is at in terms of his skill level that he brings into the classroom. And that much of the behavior is a response to the fact that I can't read this. I can't write what you're asking me to write. I can't attend for as long as you want me to attend. Therefore, screw you and the horse you rode in on. I'm not going to do it. And in many cases, the secondary education teacher doesn't even have enough knowledge of the students, because they've got 125 students, to realize that Kevin reads 3 grade levels below the content of the material I'm having him read. Now, again, Kevin's not going to raise his hand and say, excuse me, I did a readability examination of this material, and it's written at the 7th grade, 8th month, and I happen to read at the 4th grade, 3rd month, right? I just really can't do it. What Kevin's going to say is, math sucks and I'm not doing this shit. And what are we going to respond to? Kevin's being disrespectful, and has that got anything really to do with what the problem is? No, but people are looking for this quick, easy way to get him to stop swearing, and that's not where the problem lies. And so that becomes one of those issues that, again, I'm not sure there's going to be a myriad of teacher-friendly, easy interventions at the secondary ed level, quite frankly. I wish there was. I don't think that's going to, I think there are some, but I don't think that's where the biggest bang for our buck's going to be. I think we're going to have to really do a much, much better job of helping those teachers learn how to diversify what they're teaching to meet the needs of the kids they're teaching. Because we're seeing that academic diversity. You take a typical high school American history class. What do you think the range of reading levels are in that class? You know, they're tremendous. You've probably got some kids who are really still struggling with letter sound recognition. How do we typically expect kids to get American history? They're supposed to read the chapter in the book, all right? And then they're supposed to do the work. And again, the kids are not going to raise their hand and say, excuse me, while everybody else obviously can do this, I'm as dumb as a box of rocks, and I don't know how to do it, right? They're going to act up. And what we have to do is deal with the acting up, but the intervention is going to be really at the teacher level, much more than it's going to be at the student level. That's a problem.
Extending that idea a little farther, if it goes just beyond the academics into what's written into the IEP as far as behavior, what school personnel are allowed to do that parents have agreed with at a meeting. ed teacher has no idea what an IEP is, has no idea that he should also be following those guidelines because there's been a little cooperative agreement between the special ed teacher and the regular ed teacher, and there's really no reinforcement from administration to cause them to want to work together that I've seen.
Right. And I mean, how many of your teachers are going, you know what, I want lots of kids with individualized plans, right? Because I just love carrying out these individualized plans. They're wonderful, right? I've got plenty of time on my hands. And again, this is one of those areas where we're seeing schools that are taking much more of an epidemiological approach to this and saying, we need some school-wide issues, we need then some targeted issues, and then we need the ones that are, so that we really have something to keep an awful lot of kids from getting into that, I need an individualized plan. But again, that's not easy. It's not necessarily teacher-friendly to do some of these kinds of things, where we're going to start saying, look, we're going to be clear about our expectation for things like tardy. We can't have 93 different definitions of what tardy is. We can't have different policies around homework. We might have to be very clear about this. Now, a lot of teachers are going to say, that's violating my academic freedom. You know, and so and we have to fight those fights. Those become tough issues. Other areas of concern, I wish there was nice, quick, easy, yes, oh yeah, well here's 4 of them, you do these 4, everything will be fine.
At the school I'm at, I'm in a high school setting, and we don't have very many students in our program, but we have had a student that we've had problems with since August. And
Just one?
we were focusing on this one because this is the main problem that we've been having. And from everything, all the data that we've taken and all the things that we've done, and we've been documenting everything that we've been doing, it's all happening outside of the school, like before school's going on, in between classes, at lunchtime, and then of course it's going to impact what happens in the classroom. Well, the problem is, it's the support. I have been going around, and I know my higher-ups, we have a separate association within our district. And so we are in a high school building, but yet we are under a different whole entity. And so I've been going to our high school people to get help for the student because the other support is not there to help. And so I've been getting, I don't think they like this very much, but I'm trying to get what's best for the student and figure out how we are going to deal with this in our classroom every day. And so how do we get that support? And it's come to a point where we cannot, this student, we finally figured out a behavior, we're going to focus on this. All of a sudden it's stopped for this very long period of time, and now we have the student going into this going to hurt herself phase. So we've been reporting, but yet nothing, it's just like the support for us. I mean, we're being blamed for everything that's going on. Like, well, you don't have the rapport with the student. Yes, we do, but there's all these other issues with her outside. She's been foster parents, kicked around, and so my question is, where do we go from here? I mean, as far as what you can recommend, I mean, we've had meetings with the outside people telling them, you know, how can you help? Because we had tried to give her coping skills, and I set her up with psychologists, I set her up with counseling in our building, in group stuff, but yet nobody's teaching her these coping skills, and we've been trying to do it, but she needs more. So where do we go from here? I mean,
Where do you want support from? You're saying you're not getting it. Where are you looking for support that it's not there?
As far as, support within the building, so she can have counseling, get her counseling more than just letting us try to figure it out in the classroom, because we are struggling, and she needs more than just us in the classroom to deal with this.
So part of the issue is that you're an entity that's not part of the school, but you're wanting to use school resources.
Right.
And they're saying,
They're balking at
why should we give you these resources? These are for our students.
Yeah, I mean, they've been going with it because I've been and finally, just this past week, we had a counselor said, you cannot deal with this anymore. I'm like, thank you. Because it's gotten to the point to where we just don't, there's another teacher in the same room, we just don't know where to go with this anymore.
Well, and again, I think part of the issue, and we can talk more, especially this afternoon as we get into some things, is that we'll have some time for people to actually throw out some of the issues that they're dealing with. One of the things that a good functional assessment might tell you is that these are the kinds of needs we have. And one of the things that you may find from a good functional assessment is that this is not the least restrictive environment for this child. This child has greater needs, greater situations than you can possibly provide. And part of it becomes just being realistic and saying, look, this is what we're seeing. These are all the areas that this kid is showing needs in, and we can't cover them all. Now, one thing, it may be that your licensing entity or whoever, kind of may have to contract for additional services besides the classroom, either from the school district or from private providers outside, and that this is an appropriate classroom, but there are greater needs that are educational. A more painful decision will be that, yes, this child has greater needs, but they're not educational, and we can't force anyone to provide services besides educational. We're not mandated. The child may need them. Oh well, it's not a good answer, but schools are not saying, geez, there are a lot of kids you may see, this kid would really benefit from family therapy, this child would really benefit from private counseling, but they can do an adequate job academically with what you're providing once you get them there. Okay? And so it doesn't spell out as an educational disability, so that, and oftentimes schools want to make that line a lot further in than maybe it should be.
Well, yeah, and for her it is impacting her academically because her grades are being fall.
Mm-hmm.
So everything, so there is an academic impact here with all of this too. So
Then what you may find, and as you begin to look at this, oftentimes, and this is one of those nasty situations, oftentimes my experience has been that a good FBA, if it begins to show those kinds of things, how to say this politically nicely, if what it spells out is that this child, this is not the least restrictive environment, and we're going to look at another more restrictive environment, that's usually more costly. Now, can I provide those services to you and not incur a more costly placement? It oftentimes opens the doors to services that wouldn't be open just by your saying, I think we need this. Because once you've kind of written it and it's in a document, it's a tough issue. It's like it's there, and somebody better address this in terms of what's going on. So it can help serve to grease the skids to get more services if they're legitimate services and situations. Now, some communities are such that even if we recognize them, they're not available. And that's that, I don't know what to tell people about that in terms of that becomes one of those really dicey issues because the school's still mandated to provide them, but we couldn't tell you where we'd find them if we were willing to pay for them. And I don't know what to say there, and I don't know if that's the kind of situation that you might be in.
I'd like to expand on her question real quick. Most of us are housed in schools that we have like 1 or 2 classrooms, and the administration is kind of resentful that we're there anyway sometimes. So,
Sometimes, yeah. Yeah, okay.
So if you have like a behavior problem in your classroom, for the regular ed students, they'd be like suspended or detention or supported in some way. So if our students do something and the administration is like, no, don't send your kids down, we don't want to deal with it anymore, whatever. What's the consistency? How are you going to teach these students that there are consequences for throwing a chair across the room that are more than you can do in the classroom, but you're not being supported, and what do you do about that?
I think part of, and then, again, this is, I wish there were nice, quick, easy answers to this. I think one of the things people have to think about when they think about where they're going to place a classroom is what are the both likely and extreme issues of behaviors that we may experience as we begin to work with this population, and have we adequately communicated that to the district that's going to house this school, and have we sought to identify the kinds of related services and supports we need to address those kinds of kids. Also, do we have clear entrance and exit criteria into this program? That when do we begin to say this child is beginning to exhibit behaviors that are probably beyond what this program can handle, and it's time to move on? Oftentimes we wait until there's a problem, and then people kind of go, geez, when do you decide that this kid is, he's beating the heck out of people, and we don't have any way to deal with this? That's a heck of a time to start thinking about what are the exit criteria. You should have that kind of front end loaded. So if you don't have that, that might be one of those things. Because again, you've got to have the supports to be able to deal with the kids you've got, or you're not the least restrictive environment, quite frankly. If I can't meet the child's needs, and routinely they need more than this.
Okay, but as a teacher, because we have nothing to do with placement of like what schools are the best for these kids to be placed in. So as a teacher, how can we educate our administration on what our, children do?
My experience has been that if you can honestly and clearly talk about these are the kinds of things, this is what this program is all about. These are the kinds of kids we see we're going to serve, and this is the kind of support that we need. And that you can communicate that well both to the administration of the school you're in and to your people, so that if there are problems, then identifying, and here's where we seem to have constant battles. We don't seem to have this clear, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not, sometimes they do it, sometimes they don't. We really need to have this clarified. So outside of a crisis, kind of dealing with that so that you can begin to do some planful thinking about those kinds of issues. Again, I'm a big one in terms of writing it. Not just saying it and not just going to the teacher's lounge and bitching, but actually writing it down in a memo, because again, once you've got it in paper, people generally have to act on it. Now part of it again is it's a plot, because if it exists in paper and there would be somebody who would get hurt and later on they didn't do anything, that's a landmine sitting there. And so you oftentimes will get people to act on a written document that they won't act on by your just talking to them. But you've got to be realistic. I think sometimes we can get also very hysterical in what we anticipate we need. And remember that from the standpoint of inclusion, there is not a current study in existence where we have asked teachers, do you have enough support to work with the population of kids that you have? There is not one study in existence that says teachers have said, yes, I do. From the teachers who have gotten nothing to teachers who have gotten what we consider a pretty impressive level of support, teachers themselves generally do not feel they have enough support. So at least keep that in mind.
I would suggest also that you focus more of your attention upon your home district, who's the money source for the other district, because they're going to pay attention to them more than they are to you, than going directly to the hosting district.
It's good.
Because
Good.
those are the people that are paying the money. And those are the people, if they start complaining, are going to be heard more. I mean, you're going to request the services you need, but if that isn't helpful, I would make more noise in my home district than I would to the hosting district, would be my suggestion.
Because they're still responsible for meeting that child's needs. Ultimately, they're still on the hook.
We had a situation similar to what it sounds like you're describing, and we came from a school with a very responsive administration to a school, and she couldn't care less what we did. And she certainly wasn't going to come in and back us up like the old principal did. And so what we kind of did is shift our expectations so that our supervisor in the referring district, the home district, kind of became our clout, if you will. And that worked well.
So that goes right back to what he was saying, kind of getting, that's a good idea. Other things people have tried or seen or had come up? Because this is not I mean, obviously you're probably not the Lone Ranger. This is a pretty common problem. Anybody else had anything that you found to be effective? Share your expertise. All right, any other quick concerns or other concerns that we have? So again, I want to make this responsive to where you guys are at. Any other big issues? All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that are kind of going down the pike. Again, a lot of this will be review for you. Again, the process began in the 1997 amendments to IDEA. Just to kind of refer what's going on. They're saying two areas. When a child's disabilities interfere with his learning or the learning of others, you are supposed to have a behavior intervention plan. Now, being honest, in the school district that you're in, does every child with a disability whose behaviors interfere with their learning or the learning of others have a functional assessment and behavior intervention plan? Absolutely not. I don't know of a single district that I've been to, and I go to a lot of school districts that are currently meeting that mandate, or would even be able to if they tried. It's a real challenge. Okay. The next one, when a student's behavior threatens to result in a disciplinary change of placement, that tends to be the 10 days of suspension. All right, you are supposed to have a functional assessment and a behavior intervention plan. Now, this one most school districts do follow. They are in compliance with this piece, but usually not the front piece.
I thought it was 3 or more suspensions of any kind, not necessarily 10 days, but like 3 days. If a student had 3 or more, like out of school 3 days, that also then required you legally to begin an FBA?
Not that I'm aware of. Has anybody seen a change like that?
I did the accumulation of the last.
Accumulation of 10 days, yeah.
So you can, it doesn't, any combination getting to that 10th day.
Right. So it could be, if you had three 3 days, you're at 9 days, you're right at the door. But it's basically 10 days is kind of the cutting point where they're saying if you're going beyond 10 days, this child has now missed enough education that this is probably a shift in his placement. Whether you're purposefully moving him to another school or another classroom or not, if he's missing 10 days, we need to look at this. Okay? All right, again, the process, just very, very quickly in terms of what's going through, is that I have to define a target behavior. Generally, we then develop a hypothesis as to what that target behavior is all about, because that's going to help direct data collection. I have to have some hunch of what I think is going on, okay? So I think Jill here is doing this to escape, but I'm not sure. But that's what I'm thinking to begin with. Let's go ahead and start thinking about what's happening, and we're going to collect some data. We're then going to validate that function, and we're going to develop a behavior intervention plan. Now, I basically throw this up here again as a sense of review in terms that if you look at the literature, we did a study where we brought in 900 FBAs and BIPs from around the country, and we began to look at them based on what we've seen in court hearings, due process hearings, and what we see in the literature as best practices, what we see of things this and say, did the schools do a good job with this? Where are we at? Are we ready to say, hey, we've got this down, we're ready for the next step? What we found is the number one issue, and this happened a lot. In fact, we didn't find many that would have done very well had they been challenged. The number one issue was that the very beginning activity of defining the target behavior sank most of the FBAs, in that we were not clear of what the behavior was we were looking at right from the jump. Now, part of that happens because we don't have a lot of time in schools. And so we don't have time to sit down and say, let's think about what Melissa is doing specifically. You know, because how many of you have a kid who only has one target behavior? All right? Usually they've got multiple behaviors, all right? And we give them these broad general names. He's disruptive. He's aggressive. He's disrespectful. All right? And what does that mean? Well, if I ask 15 different people, I will generally get 15 different answers as to what we mean by disruptive. Now, I've been involved in a number of due process hearings, and lawyers, and we live in a very litigious area. The Chicago area has more due process hearings than most states have. There are 39 states in the United States that have fewer due process hearings than just the Cook County and its collar counties. Okay.
Is that a reflection?
Too damn many lawyers, I think. I don't know. Now, I'll tell you right off the bat, one of the fun things they do. Yeah?
Just listening to the way you talked about that, it reminds me of reading IEPs. And that's what I've noticed. A lot of people talk about the FBAs, and they use the same language that you find in IEPs. In IEPs, they use the general catchment so they can sort of throw everything in there and use that. And I think that's a problem. People aren't translating or changing the wordage when they go to the FBA.
Right. Oh yeah, and I want to, I want to be economical, right? This kid's got lots of behaviors that bother me, so I just say, well, we're going to call it disruptive behavior. And what does that include? That includes everything, right? I mean, you could actually have a, what's the target behavior? Things that piss me off, right? And it depends on my day and what mood I'm in as to what's going to be in there today, But we want to do it quick, and we want to do it dirty, kind of a thing, and we want it to be fast. We want to do, and there's an economy of scale and a lot of things going on. And so we tend to have these very oftentimes broad statements that are very poorly defined. Now, I'll tell you in the due processes that, and there's a couple, many of you may have heard of certain lawyers like Matt Cohen. Matt Cohen's naming anything to anybody? He's one of the big parent lawyers here in the Chicago area. Now, he is very quick to tell parents who are looking to do a due process for any reason whatsoever, if your child has a BIP or should have a BIP, even if you're as happy as a clam about that BIP, make it one of your issues. And the reason they're doing that is because most of the time schools are found to have done an inadequate job on this, and the school will lose on that issue. When the school loses on any issue, what does that mean for the lawyer? The district is going to pay at least part of their salary. Okay? So they are looking to find any place I can hang something on that's going to guarantee my payment in this case, and this is a ready-made deal. I'm not sure where it's at right now. When we did the study a couple of years ago, there was only 4 FBAs that had survived a due process hearing in the country. Okay? They are almost an absolute guaranteed Achilles heel for school districts. We will have been found to have done an inadequate job. Now, the very first problem, again, is that selecting the target behavior. And in a due process hearing, for example, parents get to determine whether this is an open hearing or a closed hearing. If it's a closed hearing, you cannot hear the testimony of other people who have testified in the case. They will be told to make it a closed hearing. I will then call Brenda as the first teacher, and this is especially problematic in our middle schools and our high schools. And I'll say, Brenda, can you tell me what the target behavior is that you're working here with little Kevin on? And Brenda tells me, well, it's disruptive behavior. And I go, well, wonderful. What's disruptive behavior? And she tells me what she thinks it is. Okay? I go, Lori, can you tell me the target behavior you're working on with Kevin? And Lori says, well, it's out of seat. Oh, well, what do you mean by out of seat? Thank you, Lori. Kathy, what behavior are you working on with Kevin? And Kathy gives her little 2 cents worth. What are the odds are they're going to define the same behavior and in anything close to similar terms? Slim to none. What have I just done as a lawyer for the parents? I've just won that section of the case. It is no wonder Kevin isn't improving. Hell, they're not even working on the same behavior. Okay. Now, part of the problem is that if you've sat and tried to operationally define a target behavior, it is a pain in the butt. You get people kind of going, well, I think. He's like, I don't want to care what you think. This is what we're going to do. Okay? And it becomes very tedious to clearly define a behavior. And it becomes our number one reason most of these don't work. Okay? Now, the developing the hypothesis, actually, we don't do a bad job with the schools. Usually somebody can come up with a hypothesis. Now, whether it's correct or not, who knows? But they do a pretty good job of coming up with a hypothesis. They actually tend to do a relatively good job of collecting data, quite frankly, which is surprising. In many cases, they collect way too much data. They collect data just to collect data. Right? It's like we've got data, we could sink a ship with the data we've got. And now the problem becomes trying to sort through all this data to figure out what the hell do I have here? Okay? And how many of you have collected data and what you find is that this one says this is the function, but this data says this is the function, and yet this data says it's an entirely different function, and these 3 sources didn't help me one bit. Now I've got more questions than I've got answers. Okay? So collecting the data. The next big thing, though, for getting them kicked out is that hearing officers are saying, how did you validate your function? You can't just say, well, we sat around and we thought, what do you think? Escape? Sound good? Yeah, me too. I think it is. Yeah? Let's just make it escape. And we'll write it up that way. What the hearing officers are saying is, what did you do to validate that it was escape? What they are looking for is one of 2 things. Either can you identify, and you actively do it in your FBA and BIP, you say, based on this piece of data, this piece of data, and this piece of data, we believe the issue is escape. Okay? They want 3 independent sources of information that all suggest it was the same function. Now you might have 9 pieces of data. 4 of them suggest it's escape. 1 of them suggests it's attention from the peers. 1 of them suggests it's attention from the teacher. All right, that's okay. Do you have 3 or more that say it's one thing? Yeah, then do it. They don't care if you're right. And just what they care is that did you have adequate information to warrant your decision you made? Hell, you might be wrong. That's okay. You put it in place, you give it a big shot, and see what goes on with it. But they want to know what you did. The other thing I can do is called a functional analysis. Here is where I manipulate what I believe to be the function. So if I think it's escape, that Melissa is doing something to escape, and when the work gets too hard, Melissa starts to act up so she gets kicked out of the room. What I do is I start to manipulate the difficulty level of the work. If I give her work that's relatively straightforward and that she can do with pretty good ease, what should I anticipate with the behavior? It shouldn't be a big problem. What happens as I start to make the work more difficult? I should start to see her beginning to engage in that behavior. So I can say, through a functional analysis in which I manipulated the difficulty level of the task, what we saw was that her behavior we saw the response that we anticipated, that she began to behave more inappropriately when the task got more difficult. It's 2 sentences, right? 1 or 2 sentences, all they're looking for, but you got to have it. If you don't have it, they're going to say, well, what did you base this on? And again, if I start asking people in the meeting, well, what did you base it on? What's the odds they're going to tell me the same thing? You don't even know how you came up to this decision. Right? How much faith did I put in a decision? Nobody can tell me how you came to it. Okay? And that's exactly what they're saying. Okay? That's the second most common reason they get thrown out. The third is actually the most important. And that is that people will do a wonderful functional assessment and pay no attention to it when they develop the behavior intervention plan. Okay? So I've figured out the function of Kevin's behavior, but it has nothing to do with what I'm going to do for when he engages in this behavior. It's almost like they see this as 2 kinds of little hurdles I've got to jump. As long as I've got it, I staple it in there, I put it in the thing, everybody's happy. Do you have a FBA? Yes. Do you have a BIP? Yes. Do they relate? Who cares? They're both there. Life is good. Okay? They have to relate. Okay. All right. We weren't ready for this. And again, this is kind of as a means of quick review. Schools weren't ready. To do this job and to do it well, I've got to have a bunch of skills. One is that I've got to know how to define behavior. I've got to be able to clearly delineate behavior, talk about it in observable and measurable terms. I've got to be able to write good operational definitions and good response definitions, so that if I'm looking at talkouts and Jill engages in a talkout when she says, this is bullshit. I'm not doing this crap. I hate you. Stupid. Was that 1 talkout or 4?
1.
Okay? But if we didn't agree on that, what might be the problem? Melissa's counting goes 4. Laura's counting says 1. When Laura counts, we think that Jill's behavior is better. Right? Because we never agreed. When are we going to say it happened 1 time? Right? So getting people who have skills at how to write good operational definitions, to how to break behavior down into good, meaningful, teacher-meaningful response definitions is a skill that many teachers don't have. Many people don't have in the school. The next is, how do I collect data? And again, I want reasonable data. I'm not going to try to kill a horse here with all the data I'm going to take. I want reasonable, meaningful data, some probes, whatever I want to do, but I can get a sense of what's happening. Then I've got to be able to interpret that data. Once I understand the function, then I've got this problem of I've got to sit down and say, okay, well, what are good interventions? I've got to have some knowledge of interventions, and if we look at No Child Left Behind, 111 places in that law, they said you're going to use scientifically based interventions. So not only do I have to have an intervention, I've got to have an intervention that's got some support somewhere in the literature that says this is pretty useful for a kid like Kevin. Then I've got to be able to talk the team into doing this. Right? I've got to somehow be able to work with the team so they're on board with this. We're all going to do this. We're doing this effectively. In fact, the inspector should be working this in a way that the team is part of the process of collecting this data. Now again, that's more of a dream in most districts than a reality. In most districts, it's 1 or 2 people who do it all, and then you have to sell it to the rest of the team. That's not what the law says we should be doing, but we all know that's more realistic in terms of what really happens in the real world. And it becomes much tougher. If I'm going to try to sell Dave on this plan, if Dave had no part in doing it, he has no ownership. He can kind of go, yeah, right, in your dreams. I see this kid for 55 minutes. Why the hell would I want to do this for this kid? This is way too much work. Okay.
Does the law say that, or the new rules and regs say that you have to have scientifically based research strategies for a BIP, or just for determination of eligibility or?
No Child Left Behind, again, in 111 places, says for interventions with children, so that they can meet or exceed. We are supposed to use scientifically based interventions. Now, if you're telling me, for example, you just told me that this child's behavior is interfering with her ability to meet or exceed, and make educational progress. Hearing officers are interpreting that as saying then that requires an intervention, and that intervention must be scientifically based. Okay? What they're not clear on what the hell they mean by scientifically based. All right? That's where we're there's a lot of wiggle room. And quite frankly, many interventions, it becomes a battle of wits. Their experts will come in and tell you why your interventions were not scientifically based, and all the research that has shown that it's equivocal at best these even work. And I can show you at least 3 places where your intervention actually causes more harm. And your expert's going to come in and say, oh, well, yeah, but this other literature suggests that this is the best thing since sliced bread. And it becomes a battle of experts. But from the standpoint of at least of school and teachers, you should be aware that there is this expectation that you're going to use scientifically based interventions. Now, in the long run, what this might mean is that in some cases, especially if you've got some really high, those high maintenance kind of kids, be expecting the parent might come and say, can you show me where this kind of an intervention has been shown to be effective with a child like mine? And we might want to anticipate that if we're going into an IEP meeting that we're going to talk about an FBA and a BIP, if you've got a parent who is likely to ask those kinds of questions. I'm in a case right now where it's a child with very, very significant ADHD. Mom is a psychologist. Now she knows ADHD backwards and forwards, far better than most people at the school. Well, if you go in and start talking to her about what you're going to do with her son, you better be up to snuff on what we know about ADHD and reasonable school interventions with a child like that.
You just said a reasonable school interventions because there is so much out there right now because of RTI that there are so many websites to find great scientifically based interventions. With ED, it's less likely. I mean, there's so much more written about ADHD. Those are fairly easy to find. We've got kids who will probably, have a mental health issue, have not been diagnosed. And I think most of us go to reasonable. But we also try to incorporate the parent in on the whole plan so that we don't run into those things. And we use it as a working document that if something doesn't work, then we revise it. But I think most of us go to reasonable because there's not a whole lot of information out there right now as to what is scientifically based research for behavior. I mean, we have these general things that have been given to us by these great plans for the school, but reasonable is more what we do, not scientifically based.
Unfortunately, the law doesn't say either or. It's supposed to be scientifically based reasonable. Okay? The school has been given the responsibility and the right to determine methodology. Okay? So I can't as a parent come and say, well, I want you to use this intervention style. I've gone to the internet, I've talked to so-and-so, and my psychologist, my psychiatrist, all say this is what you should be doing. And you can say, well, that's fine. It's a very good intervention. Unfortunately, that is not the intervention we're using at the school. This is the intervention we're going to use, and here is the support that we have. This is an effective intervention. You get to choose the methodology. Now, schools, you obviously want to live, the parent is part of the team, so obviously I want to work with the parents, I want to deal with the parents, but do not get into the situation where you say, well, I want to do this, but the parents wanted this. I can't defend it, I don't believe it, but that's what mom and dad wanted. So that's what we did, thinking that you are somehow covered because mom and dad wanted this. There's a due process going on right now where each parent wanted full inclusion, regular education for their child with CP, very, very cognitively impaired, kindergarten through grade 12. Full inclusion, regular classes. Child cannot toilet themselves, can't help in the process, has very few of the kinds of skills. They cannot find any group home, an adult living facility at all that will take this child or even consider working with this child, well, young adult now. They are now going to the school district, after the school district, and saying, what the hell were you doing listening to us? We're parents, for God's sakes. You're professional educators. What were you doing agreeing to us when that is not what was in the best interest of my child? And they are looking for compensatory years of education, and they will probably win. Okay? You are paid to bring your professional knowledge to the table, not to be dictated to, not to dictate to. But you are responsible to bring your professional knowledge. And if you disagree with what's come up in a team, you are to write a dissension. The Office of the ISB is now looking, when they come and do school reviews of your IEPs, they are actually looking for letters of dissension because they're saying, we just pulled 65 IEPs from this school for the last 2 years. Not one dissension. What's the odds that we can bring 60 groups of people together to talk about something as complex as an educational plan for a child and not have one person disagree? Slim to none. So they're looking for letters of dissension. So this is not the kind of thing it was a few years ago where if you did that you were kind of putting your job on the line. Now school districts got to be looking for people to do this every now and then because you probably should have a few. Okay? It doesn't mean the end of the world if you say, I really don't agree. So in a case where they'd say, this is the best place for this child, and you're going, boy, I think this kid needs a whole lot more than what you're willing to give. The IEP doesn't come up with that. You might write a letter of dissension saying, I disagree with this as the least restrictive placement for the following reasons. And you specify what those are. Now, it's not going to change a damn thing. The kid is still going to go wherever mom and the parents and the school district representatives say they're going to go. But your letter of dissension becomes part of the IEP. Down the road, if there's a problem, that might then be looked at and say, well, okay, well, there was a dissension here. Let's take another look at this because it hasn't worked out too well. Let's see what else we needed to do. And you shouldn't feel bad about doing that. Schools shouldn't feel bad if you do that. Okay? It's one of those things that we need to be doing more of.
You say the letters of dissension can be written, you're talking mainly about placement, or can they be written regarding specific goals?
They can be written about anything in the IEP, any aspect that the IEP is dealing with. So it can be issues around goals being appropriate, placements being appropriate, accommodations given or not given. If your district happens to be one of these places that has an IEP that's a checklist for accommodations, my experience has been that when you go into those meetings and there's this page that has just 95 different things you could check, what do you see parents and people wanting to do? Let's check them all, right? My kid could certainly benefit from this, and from this, and from that. Well, my son graduated as valedictorian. He too could have benefited from a whole bunch of those. All right? That's not why we do accommodations. We do accommodations if they truly need this to be on a level playing field. Okay? So you might look at this and say, okay, I'm the teacher of record. I just looked at this and this kid has got 43 accommodations. It is going to be darn near impossible for me to do this and do this legitimately, and he doesn't need these. Then you might write a letter of dissension about that. All right, again, it's not going to change it, but it's a start. Okay? You've got to use the things that you do have at your disposal. They were put there for a reason. They are to help you and to help me, because what you want is a reasonable plan. Now, where the problem comes into play as far as scientifically based, let's say you as a district, again, get pushed. And I say, can you show me what you're doing is scientific? First of all, can you even tell me what you're doing? All right, can you define what the intervention is? Can you tell me where you saw this to be supported as scientifically based for this child? If you cannot tell me this, and tell it to me in cogent enough terminology that makes me convinced as a hearing officer that you know what you're doing, generally the school district will lose and the parent's methodology will get ordered as the methodology. This is really significant when it gets, like if you're working with children with autism. Oftentimes schools will say, well, we have an eclectic approach. And you kind of go, well, that's cool, an eclectic approach is all right. Eclectic is good. Can you tell me what the parts are of your eclectic approach and how they work together and the support you have for those? And nobody can talk about it with any intelligence whatsoever as to what the hell the approach is. Now that happened in a school district here in the Chicago area, and they were then ordered to implement what the parents wanted as their intervention tool. Because you can't tell me what you're doing. So there is an aspect, and again, it's not just, it befalls the whole district, not just you, but oftentimes you're kind of that point person, and you should know a little bit about what's going on. And again, can be very problematic for secondary education teachers where I don't even want this kid with special needs in my classroom, much less do I know what I'm supposed to be doing and how I'm supposed to be doing it. Can be a real challenge. The other issue comes down to, let's say I've got a good secondary education teacher. I've got this BIP. And this BIP talks about things that we're going to use pre-correction. We know this is a child with ADHD.